The afternoon sun hung low over Dustwood, casting long, sharp shadows across the dusty main street. Clara Bennett stood at the schoolhouse door, the hem of her simple blue dress fluttering in the breeze. Her last student had left minutes ago, yet she lingered, staring out toward the saloon where laughter and rowdy shouts spilled into the open air. She felt the stares, always the stares, from the passers-by. Some looked away quickly. Others let their gaze linger, heavy with judgment. A widowed schoolteacher in a town like Dustwood was an easy target for talk, and Clara had learned that the whispers could cut deeper than any blade. In a place where everyone knew everyone, gossip traveled faster than a prairie fire. The rumors about Clara had started small, harmless even, about her refusing a dinner invitation from a local shopkeeper. But soon they grew darker. The women whispered that she was too proud for her own good, that she thought herself above them. The men muttered about how she turned up her nose at the wrong people. In truth, she had simply learned to keep her distance. She was polite, professional, and guarded. But in Dustwood, rejecting the wrong man could be a dangerous thing. Sheriff Randall, the man who ruled the town with a polished badge and a cruel smile, had made his interests known in ways that weren't entirely subtle. He lingered too close when she passed him in the general store, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her stomach knot. Twice, he'd sent flowers to her doorstep, each bouquet accompanied by a note written in a heavy, confident hand. Clara had ignored them. She didn't trust him, not his charm, not his authority, and certainly not his intentions. Her refusal didn't go unnoticed. One evening, as she walked home from the schoolhouse, she overheard two women on a porch whispering about her. "Sheriff don't take kindly to being turned down," one said, rocking slowly in her chair. "She's playing with fire," the other replied, shaking her head. Clara walked on, keeping her chin high, but her heart sank. She knew they were right. Randall wasn't the sort of man to forget a slight. Her late husband, Thomas Bennett, had been the only man she'd ever trusted. He was quiet, steady, and kind. Everything this harsh land often lacked. His death, 2 years ago, still didn't sit right with her. Officially, it had been a riding accident, but Clara knew Thomas was a skilled horseman. She had always suspected there was more to the story, though she had no proof. Whenever she tried to speak of her doubts, the townsfolk grew uncomfortable, glancing around as if the very air might betray them. That evening, Clara locked the schoolhouse and started to walk to her small rented home. The town felt colder than usual, though the air was warm. A group of men stood outside the saloon, laughter dying as she passed. She could feel their eyes on her back, the weight of their smirks pressing between her shoulder blades. When she reached her porch, there was something waiting for her, another bouquet of flowers. This one, however, was not fresh. The petals were wilted, the stems brittle, and tied around them was a thin strip of paper with a single word scrawled across it, "Last chance." Her hands trembled as she took the bouquet inside. She tossed it into the waste bin and bolted the door, her mind racing. Sheriff Randall was making it clear. Her refusals wouldn't be tolerated much longer. That night, sleep came fitfully. Every creak of the house made her sit up, listening, waiting. The next morning began like any other, though an unease clung to her as she walked into the schoolhouse. The children's laughter was a brief reprieve in the tension, their innocent faces a reminder of why she endured this town's cruelty. But halfway through the day, 2 deputies appeared at the door. They were tall, stone-faced men who barely glanced at the children before saying, "Mrs. Bennett, you'll need to come with us." Confusion turned to shock as they told her the charge, theft from the general store. Clara laughed at first, certain it was a mistake, but the deputies weren't smiling. A store ledger had been found with missing entries, and witnesses claimed they'd seen her near the storeroom after hours. It was all too neat, too convenient. Clara's stomach dropped as she realized exactly whose influence could make such lies take root. The walk through town felt like a public trial. Faces appeared in doorways. Whispers followed her, and more than one person looked satisfied. Sheriff Randall stood on the steps of the jailhouse, arms crossed, a faint smirk on his lips. "Seems we got a problem here," he drawled. "But maybe we can work something out." His eyes flickered with meaning, a private proposition in plain sight. Clara's cheeks burned with fury and shame. She said nothing, only lifted her chin and walked past him into the small cell. She knew then that this wasn't about justice. It was about control. Randall meant to humiliate her, to force her into submission. By evening, the deputies told her she was free to go. No explanation, no paperwork. But it was clear the damage had been done. Her reputation, fragile as it was, lay in tatters. Neighbors avoided her gaze. Friends kept their distance. And tucked into the doorframe of her home was another note. Leave, or next time, it'll be worse. That night, Clara packed what little she owned into a small satchel. She stood in the doorway of her home, looking out at the quiet street one last time. The town's cold heart had made its choice, and now she had no choice of her own. With the moon high above and the desert stretching endlessly beyond, she stepped into the darkness, away from Dustwood, away from the life she'd built, and toward an uncertain fate. The sun was setting in long amber streaks over the dusty rooftops of Dry Creek when Sheriff Randall stepped into his office, slamming the door behind him. His jaw was clenched, his boots heavy on the worn wooden floor. A week had passed since Clara Bennett had refused his marriage proposal, in front of 2 other townsfolk, no less, and the sting of public humiliation burned hotter than any desert sun. He stood at the window, watching her through the grimy glass as she locked up the small schoolhouse for the day. That simple act, her head held high, her quiet defiance, was enough to set his temper ablaze. No woman had ever told Randall no, and lived to make him look weak. "Boys," he growled, as 2 of his deputies leaned lazily against the desk, "it's time we deal with the schoolmarm." The deputies exchanged looks. They knew the sheriff's brand of dealing often meant more than just words. He leaned over the desk, voice low and sharp. "I want her gone. Tonight. And I don't care where you take her, as long as she never makes it back." There was a heavy pause. Then Randall straightened, tugging on his gloves with deliberate menace. "Make it look clean for the town. Tell anyone who asks that she left to live with her sister out east. But you and I both know where she's really going." That evening, Clara was preparing a meager supper in her tiny rented room above the tailor's shop when a knock came at the door. She opened it to find the sheriff's 2 men standing there with 4 smiles. "Miss Bennett," one said smoothly, "Sheriff thought you might like an escort. Said it's not safe for a lady to be traveling alone at night." She frowned. "Traveling? I'm not going anywhere." The taller deputy tipped his hat. "Now, ma'am," the sheriff arranged it. Best not to keep him waiting. Clara's instincts prickled with unease, but the cold finality in their eyes told her she had little choice. They led her to a waiting wagon. The streets were eerily quiet, only the faint sound of a saloon piano drifting through the night. Once out of town, the wagon rolled into the open plains, and Clara realized with a jolt they weren't heading toward the main road east. "Where are we going?" she asked, voice steady but tight. The deputy said nothing. The air grew colder, the land more barren. Hours passed in tense silence until the faint glow of the town was nothing but a memory behind them. When the wagon finally stopped, Clara stepped down and found herself in the middle of the desert. No homes, no road, just rolling dunes of pale sand under the moonlight. The deputies climbed back onto the wagon without a word. "Wait," she began, but the whip cracked and the horses surged forward. In moments, the sound of hooves faded into the vast emptiness, leaving her alone. A dry wind cut across the open desert, tugging at her shawl and whipping grit into her eyes. Clara's breath came fast, panic clawing at her chest. They'd left her with nothing. No food, no water, no sense of direction. She thought of Randall, smug and sure she wouldn't make it until morning. For a moment, the hopelessness nearly crushed her, but then something inside her hardened. She'd survived the gossip, the cold stares, the loneliness after her husband's death. She could survive this. Pulling her shawl tighter, Clara began to walk. Each step felt heavier than the last, her boots sinking into the soft sand. She scanned the horizon for any sign of shelter, but all she saw was a vast, endless night. Her throat was already dry, and she could feel the chill seeping through her bones. Still, She pressed on, her mind repeating the same words over and over like a prayer. I will not die here. I will not give him the satisfaction. By the time the moon reached its highest point, Clara's legs ached, and her lips were cracked from thirst. She stumbled over a patch of uneven ground, catching herself with trembling hands. The night felt unervingly alive. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of something unseen in the brush. Every sound made her heart hammer harder, but she kept moving. Somewhere deep inside, Clara knew that survival would mean more than just endurance. It would mean outsmarting Randall, proving to him and to herself that he'd underestimated her. That thought kept her moving through the desert shadows, each step carrying her farther away from the life she'd known and deeper into the unknown. Somewhere, somehow, she would find a way out. The desert stretched endlessly before Clara, a shimmering sea of gold and bone-white sand. The sun blazed overhead, a merciless ore that seemed determined to burn her into the earth. The sheriff's men had ridden off without a backward glance, leaving only their laughter echoing faintly in the hot air. Clara stood alone, her hands trembling, the wide-brimmed hat she clutched during the ride now gone, snatched away like the last scrap of dignity she had. They had taken everything. Her water, her food, even the sturdy boots she had worn to teach in. The thin, worn leather slippers on her feet were already tearing, the soles barely holding together. She could feel every jagged rock cutting into her skin as she stumbled forward. Sweat trickled down her face, stinging her eyes, and the salt on her lips reminded her how desperately she needed water. The heat wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. The horizon wavered, the air bending into strange mirages that looked like water in the distance, false promises that lured and mocked her at the same time. The desert was alive with sounds, the dry whisper of wind against sand, the distant hiss of a rattlesnake, and the hollow flap of vultures circling high above. Each step was a battle. The sun pressed down on her shoulders, and the ground seemed to radiate heat straight into her bones. She thought of the small schoolhouse she had left behind, the smell of chalk and ink, the eager faces of the children she had taught. For a moment, she imagined herself back there in the cool shade, with laughter in the air instead of the ominous beat of her own heart. But the memory faded quickly, replaced by the ache in her limbs. Her throat felt like sandpaper, her tongue thick and dry. She knew enough about the desert to understand how little time she had. Without water, the body gave up quickly. Panic began to claw at the edges of her thoughts, whispering that this was where she would die, her bones bleaching under the same sun that burned her now. She tried to focus on something else. Anything else. Her husband's face came to her mind, his warm smile and steady hands. She remembered the day he had walked her home from the church social, his voice low and gentle as he told her she was unlike anyone he'd ever met. The memory brought a tear to her eye, and that single tear felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. As the day wore on, her legs grew weaker. She stumbled over a half-buried rock, falling to her knees. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her, but she forced herself up again, though each movement felt heavier than the last. She glanced up and saw the vultures again. Closer now, their dark shapes gliding in slow circles. They were waiting. Her vision began to blur, the edges darkening. She wasn't sure if the shapes ahead were rocks or the silhouettes of men, and she no longer trusted her eyes. She thought she heard a horse in the distance, but it might have been the wind playing tricks. Still, the sound made her heart leap, until it faded away into silence. The sun began its slow descent, but the heat did not relent. Clara's body swayed with each step, her mind drifting in and out of lucidity. She whispered her husband's name, hoping somehow his spirit could guide her. She thought of the promise she had made to herself after his death, to never bow to cruelty, to never surrender her will. It was that stubborn resolve that kept her moving, even as her body screamed for rest. By the time she reached a small rise in the ground, her knees buckled without warning. She fell forward into the sand, her cheek pressing into its coarse, scorching surface. Her arms wouldn't lift her anymore. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The sky above had taken on an orange hue, but she barely noticed. She was dimly aware of the vultures drawing lower, their wings casting fleeting shadows over her still form. The air was heavy, the desert silent except for the distant hiss of wind. Clara closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in the strange calm that came when the fight was too far gone. She thought, if I die here, at least I stood my ground. The world faded, and the desert claimed her in silence. Ethan Cole had grown used to silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind that comforted the soul, but the heavy, echoing silence that reminded him of what he'd lost. His small ranch sat at the far edge of the valley, where the land rolled into empty plains and the horizon stretched forever. Once, the ranch had been alive with laughter, his wife's soft singing in the mornings, his little boy's giggles when chasing chickens. Now, the wind was his only companion. He moved through his days with practiced routine. Mornings meant feeding the horses, checking the fences, and riding into the lower pasture to inspect the cattle. Evenings meant mending what was broken, eating alone by the dim glow of a lantern, and listening to the coyotes cry in the distance. People in town had stopped trying to coax him back into social life years ago. Loss had carved him into stone, and Ethan preferred it that way. That afternoon, the sun hung low but fierce, painting the sky in hard shades of gold and white. Ethan was returning from a supply run to town, his saddlebags heavy with flour, beans, and a tin of coffee. His horse, Dusty, moved steadily along the trail, the rhythmic clop of hooves matching the measured beat of his heart. Out here, away from the chatter of people, he felt at least somewhat alive. A sudden movement caught his attention, a dark cluster shifting against the bright sky. Vultures. They wheeled in slow, ominous circles over a patch of land beyond the ridge. Ethan frowned. Out here, vultures usually meant a dead animal, or worse. His grip on the reins tightened. Something in his gut told him this was no ordinary carcass. He nudged Dusty into a faster trot, the dry grass crunching under the horse's hooves. The closer he rode, the sharper the smell of heat and dust became. The vultures dipped lower, restless. When he crested the ridge, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There, sprawled in the sand, was a woman. Her dress was torn and dust-covered. Her skin burned raw from the relentless sun. Her lips were cracked, and her hair clung to her damp forehead. She wasn't moving, not much, anyway. The faint rise and fall of her chest told him she was still alive, but barely. Ethan swung down from his horse, his boots crunching in the sand. "Miss?" he called, his voice rough from disuse. No answer. He crouched beside her, brushing away the hair from her face. The woman's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes clouded with pain and exhaustion. "Water," she whispered, her voice as thin as a desert wind. Ethan quickly reached into his saddlebag, pulling out his canteen. He tipped it gently against her lips, careful not to let her drink too fast. She swallowed greedily, the sound raw and desperate. "Easy now," he murmured, steadying her head with one callous hand. She managed a small nod, but her gaze darted nervously toward the empty expanse behind him. "They left me," she rasped. Her words broke, but Ethan didn't press for more. Not yet. Without another word, he slid his arms beneath her, surprised at how light she felt, as if the desert had already begun to strip her down to bone. He lifted her onto Dusty's back, positioning her so she could lean against the saddle horn. Ethan swung up behind her, securing his arms to keep her steady. The vultures scattered at the sound of the horse's hooves as he guided Dusty toward home. As they rode, Ethan's mind raced. Whoever had done this hadn't just abandoned her. They'd meant for her to die. He didn't know who she was or what trouble she found herself in, but one thing was certain. He wasn't about to let the desert claim her, not while he still had the strength to fight it. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel quite so empty. The rhythmic clop of hooves echoed in the stillness as Ethan urged his horse toward the safety of his ranch. Clara's head rested limply against his chest, her breath shallow and uneven. The desert wind still clung to her clothes, whispering of the cruelty she had endured. By the time they reached the weathered gates of his property, the first faint stars had begun to prick the sky. Ethan dismounted carefully, cradling her fragile frame as though she might break apart at the slightest touch. His old cabin, with its rough-hewn walls and flickering lamplight, stood like a lone guardian in the wild expanse. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of wood smoke. Ethan laid Clara gently on his small cot, its faded quilt clean, but worn from years of use. He fetched a basin of cool water, dipping a rag and brushing it across her sunburned skin. Clara flinched at the touch, her eyes fluttering open for only a moment before drifting shut again. "You're safe here," he said quietly, though the words fell foreign on his tongue. He couldn't remember the last time he had offered comfort to anyone. When she finally stirred enough to sit up, Ethan brought her a cup of water. Clara drank greedily, droplets running down her chin, and for a moment he looked away, not wanting her to feel observed in her desperation. She tried to speak, but her voice was no more than a rasp. "Don't force it," he told her, placing a plate of bread and dried meat on the small table. She ate slowly, eyes darting around the cabin, as though weighing whether this place was a refuge or another cage. As the night deepened, they exchanged sparse words, each guarded by invisible walls. Ethan spoke little of himself, only that he lived alone and preferred it that way. Clara offered even less, her gaze fixed on the fire, but in the silences between them there was a faint recognition. Two souls adrift, both weathered by loss. The loneliness was almost a tangible thing in the room, heavy but oddly shared. When the meal was done, Ethan stoked the fire and stepped back. "You should rest," he said, gesturing to the cot. "I'll take the chair." She hesitated, scanning his face for any hint of deceit. Years of betrayal had taught her to be suspicious of kindness, and yet there was no hunger in his eyes, only a quiet weariness that matched her own. She lay down slowly, pulling the quilt to her chin, and though her body ached, she found a flicker of safety in the steady crackle of the flames and the distant sound of his boots pacing on the wooden floor. That night, sleep came to Clara in broken waves, each dream haunted by the desert and the sheriff's men. But each time she woke in a sweat, she saw Ethan nearby, his silhouette by the window, watching the horizon as though keeping something or someone at bay. Ethan sat quietly at the edge of the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the desert wind whispered through the dry grass. The sun was beginning to set, casting the land in a deep burnt orange glow. Inside the small cabin, Clara sipped from a tin cup of warm tea, her eyes following him through the dusty window. She had been at his ranch for 2 days now, her body slowly recovering, but her mind still a storm of fear and uncertainty. Tonight, something in the air felt heavier than before, like both of them had unspoken truths that couldn't stay hidden much longer. When she finally stepped outside, the boards creaked under her bare feet. Ethan turned slightly, offering her the seat next to him. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of a distant coyote howl. Then, with a shaky breath, Clara spoke. She told him about Sheriff Randall, how he had made his intentions clear the moment her husband died, how his persistent offers turned to threats when she refused him, and how the town slowly turned against her because of his influence. Her voice trembled as she described being dragged from her home and left in the desert, abandoned like she was nothing. Ethan's jaw tightened as he listened, his hands, callous and scarred from years of ranch work, clenched around his cup. When she finished, he stared at the darkening horizon for a long moment before saying, "I know what it's like to lose everything because of one man's cruelty." His voice was deep, but there was a faint tremor in it. Clara looked at him, surprised by the emotion in his words. Slowly, he told her about the fire, how it swept to the town years ago, taking his wife and little girl while he was away on cattle work. He explained how the fire wasn't an accident at all, but cover-up for a crime committed by a corrupt group of men protected by the law. When he tried to seek justice, he'd been beaten and warned to leave it alone. The sheriff at the time was no different from Randall now, full of power, untouchable. That night, Ethan left town for good, choosing the isolation of the desert over the poison of men like that. His voice grew quieter as he said, "It's easier to live with ghosts than with the kind of hate that never dies." Clara felt an ache in her chest that was different from fear. It was a sting of understanding. She saw in Ethan's eyes the same loneliness that had been eating away at her. For a brief moment, she wanted to believe this was more than just a place to hide. But as the wind picked up, the thought of Sheriff Randall finding her twisted her stomach. She told Ethan, "He won't let me go. He'll come, and he'll bring trouble with him." Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and glanced toward the barn where his horse was tied, then toward the rifle leaning inside the doorway. His voice was calm but resolute when he finally said, "Then we'll be ready." Something about the way he said we made Clara's heart pound. She wasn't alone anymore, but that also meant danger might follow them both. That night, as the moon rose over barren land, the desert felt different. No longer just a place of death and emptiness. It had become a fragile refuge, a space where two broken souls had begun to share their truths. But both knew it couldn't last forever. Somewhere out there, Randall's shadow was moving closer. And when it arrived, the desert would no longer be silent. The days at Ethan's ranch began to blend together, each one stitched with quiet routines and unspoken understanding. Clara's strength returned slowly, but with it came a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. She found herself waking early, the scent of coffee drifting from the small kitchen as the morning light spilled through the dusty windows. Ethan, ever the quiet man, was usually already outside, tending to the horses or repairing something that didn't quite need repairing, as though keeping his hands busy kept his mind from wandering to darker places. Clara began helping where she could, her hands finding work naturally, washing clothes, patching old curtains, sweeping the wooden floors that creaked with every step. She noticed how Ethan's home, though sturdy, had a certain emptiness to it. There were no photographs on the walls, no little touches of warmth, as if he deliberately stripped the place of reminders. She took it upon herself to change that, rearranging small things, bringing in fresh wildflowers from the field, and even mending a faded quilt she found in the storage chest. Ethan never said anything about it, but she noticed the way his gaze lingered on her work a little longer each day. One afternoon, while Ethan was trying to repair a section of the fence, Clara joined him. She stood beside him, passing nails and holding planks steady as he hammered. There was a rhythm to it, the creak of wood, the ring of the hammer, and the occasional shared glance that said more than words could. When a stubborn post refused to settle into place, Ethan grumbled under his breath, and Clara laughed, the sound surprising them both. He looked at her then, really looked, and for a fleeting moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. In the evenings, they began sitting together after dinner, sometimes talking, sometimes simply listening to the wind whistle through the ranch. Clara discovered Ethan's secret embarrassment. Though he could read, his skills were rough. She offered to help, pulling out old books and teaching him to read more confidently. At first he resisted, but eventually he gave in, muttering about how a cowboy didn't need fancy words, even as he leaned closer to follow the line she pointed to. Their laughter over his stubborn mispronunciations filled the small cabin with a warmth neither of them had felt in years. They also shared quiet moments outside, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. The sky would blaze in gold and crimson, the kind of beauty that made you forget the weight of the past. Sometimes their hands would brush accidentally, and neither would pull away right away. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something dangerous and fragile, a spark they both felt but didn't dare name. As the days stretched on, Clara realized she was beginning to trust him. Not completely, but enough to feel safe in his presence. Ethan, for his part, seemed to carry a silent awareness of her fears, never pressing too hard, never asking for more than she could give. In the stillness of those desert nights, surrounded by the sound of the wind and the distant howl of coyotes, a quiet bond was weaving itself between them. Neither knew where it would lead, but both knew it was something worth holding on to. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Ethan noticed a distant dust cloud rising on the eastern trail. His sharp instincts told him this wasn't a wandering herd or a passing stagecoach. The cloud was too concentrated, too deliberate. He paused mid-chop, the axe still lodged in a block of wood, and narrowed his eyes toward the horizon. Trouble was coming, and he already had a good guess whose trouble it would be. Inside the cabin, Clara was humming faintly while folding the freshly dried laundry. The peaceful rhythm of her hands was interrupted by Ethan's sudden, tense entry. "Clara," he said low, almost in a growl, "we got riders coming fast." She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "Do you think it's—" She didn't have to finish. They both knew. Sheriff Randall had found her. By mid-morning, 5 armed men came into full view, their horses kicking up grit, and their eyes sweeping over the ranch like hungry wolves. At their center sat Deputy Harlan, a wiry man with a smug grin, clearly enjoying his role as Randall's enforcer. "Cole," he shouted, reining in his horse just beyond the fence line. "We've come for the lady. Sheriff says she belongs back in town." His tone dripped with false authority. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, shotgun in hand, but resting casually at his side. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said evenly. "And she sure as hell isn't going with you." The men shifted in their saddles, fingers twitching near their revolvers. Clara stood just inside the doorway, gripping the frame so hard her knuckles whitened. Her mind screamed at her to hide, but her pride kept her rooted. Harlan's smirk widened. "You don't want to make this ugly, Cole. Sheriff says she's a criminal. Thief, liar, and worse. Says she ran off with his property." Ethan took a single step forward, his voice cutting like a blade. "The only liar here is your boss. Now, you best turn around before this turns into something none of you can walk away from." The wind seemed to still, the only sound the creak of leather saddles and the distant caw of a hawk overhead. One of the men shifted his rifle, angling it toward the cabin. Ethan's gaze followed the motion, his jaw tightening. "You point that again, and you won't have hands to use it," he warned, his voice calm but deadly. Clara felt a strange, steadying wave wash over her. Despite her fear, Ethan's presence anchored her like solid rock against a storm. Harlan tried again, his voice rising with frustration. "This ain't worth dying over, Cole. Just hand her over, and we'll say you cooperated." Ethan tilted his head slightly, as though considering the offer. Then his voice came low, steel cold. "You tell Randall if he wants her, he can come himself. And when he does, he better bring more than 5 men." The standoff stretched for long, breathless seconds. Finally, Harlan spat into the dirt, signaling his men to turn. "This ain't over, cowboy," he said, his tone promising retribution. The riders wheeled their horses and thundered off, the dust swallowing them until they were only a distant blur. Ethan stood watching until the last hoofbeat faded. Only then did Clara step outside, her face pale but her chin lifted. "You just made him angrier," she said, though there was no accusation in her voice, only worry. Ethan turned to her, his eyes softening just a fraction. "Let him get as mad as he wants. He's not laying a finger on you." As the sun sank lower, casting the desert in molten gold, Clara found herself standing beside Ethan on the porch. They didn't speak much, but the quiet between them wasn't empty. It was a vow, unspoken but strong. Trouble would come again, and soon, but for now, she was safe. And for now, that was enough. The morning sun rose over the desert, casting long golden streaks across the rugged land. Ethan had been up before dawn, his jaw tight and eyes sharp. He moved methodically, placing barrels and crates as makeshift cover points around the ranch. Every creak of wood and clang of metal was deliberate, a soldier preparing for war. Clara stood on the porch, her hands trembling as she clutched the rifle Ethan had given her. She had never held a weapon before, but the fear in her eyes was matched by a growing determination. This was no longer just Ethan's fight. The sheriff had stolen too much from her already, and she wouldn't let him take anything more. By midday, dust clouds began to rise in the distance, announcing the sheriff's arrival long before the sound of hooves reached the ranch. Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle, scanning the horizon. Clara stood beside him, steadying her breath. The sheriff rode at the head of his gang, a cruel smirk plastered on his face. His men fanned out, rifles glinting under the sun. "Step aside, Cole," the sheriff's voice rang out, cold and mocking. "Hand over the woman, and I'll let you live." Ethan didn't answer. His silence was a defiance. The first shot cracked the air like a whip, and chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the drywood of the fence as Ethan returned fire, forcing the gang to take cover. Clara, heart pounding, crouched behind a water trough, just as Ethan had instructed. But when she saw a man creeping along the side to flank Ethan, she raised her rifle, her hand shaking. She fired. The shot startled even her, but the man fell, clutching his shoulder. For the first time, Clara felt the raw rush of fighting back. The sheriff pushed forward, firing from horseback, his voice booming orders to his men. Ethan darted between cover points, his movement swift and precise. Clara joined him in reloading, their eyes meeting briefly, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. A sudden shout erupted from the far side as Ethan's well-placed traps, hidden ropes and spikes, sent two riders tumbling. The balance was shifting. Seeing his men falter, the sheriff charged directly toward Ethan, gun blazing. Ethan dug behind a post, returning fire, one bullet grazing the sheriff's arm. The man's smirk twisted into a snarl as blood seeped through his sleeve. Another shot from Ethan's rifle caught him in the leg, sending him crashing to the dirt. The gunfight slowed, the air thick with dust and gunpowder. The remaining men, seeing their leader wounded and surrounded, began to retreat into the desert. Ethan walked toward the sheriff, rifle still steady, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Clara followed, her heart pounding in her ears. The sheriff tried to push himself up, but Ethan's shadow fell over him. "It's over," Ethan said, his voice low and final. Clara stepped forward, her voice cold and unwavering. "You don't get to hurt anyone else." The sheriff's eyes flickered between them, realizing the fight and his control were gone. They tied the sheriff's hands, the ropes biting into his wrists. Clara looked out over the horizon, the dust trails of retreating riders disappearing into the heat haze. She felt the weight of what had just happened, the fear, the violence, the survival, but also a strange lightness. For the first time in months, she wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. Beside her, Ethan gave a small nod. The ranch had held, and so had they, but both knew this was just the beginning of what came next.